Welcome, and allow yourself to settle into a comfortable position as we embark on a journey through the shadows and complexities of Viking Age Scandinavia. Tonight, we'll explore 4 interconnected facets of medieval Norse life, each revealing layers of a civilization far more nuanced than popular imagination suggests. Our path will take us first into the intimate and often harsh realities of Viking marriage customs, where romance had little place and young women faced rituals that would shock modern sensibilities. From there, we'll follow the blood-soaked rise and dramatic fall of Eric Bloodaxe, a Norwegian king whose brutal methods ultimately sealed his doom. We'll then uncover the mysteries surrounding the Oseberg ship burial, where 2 powerful women were laid to rest with treasures that still puzzle archaeologists today. Finally, we'll step into the opulent Great Hall of a Viking Jarl, discovering a world of unexpected luxury and sophisticated culture. These stories, woven together, paint a portrait of Viking society that challenges every simple assumption. Here was a civilization capable of both shocking brutality and remarkable refinement, where women could wield extraordinary power even as others faced severe subjugation, and where political violence coexisted with artistic achievement and international commerce. Let the flickering shadows of history draw you in as we begin with the most personal and disturbing aspects of Norse life, the wedding night traditions that transformed young women's lives forever. Imagine yourself as a young Norse woman in 9th century Norway, and tonight marks the most significant transition of your existence, your wedding night. But this isn't the romanticized vision that modern storytelling presents. You're about to experience rituals rooted in a culture where marriage served as a political and economic transaction rather than a romantic union, customs that would profoundly shock contemporary sensibilities. Your transformation began before dawn, not with excitement, but with a gnawing anxiety that settled in your stomach like cold stone. The morning ritual started with what they called the bride's bath, a ceremonial cleansing that involved your female relatives scrubbing your skin with harsh lye soap in water so cold it made your breath catch in your throat. The soap, crafted from animal fat and wood ash, burned against your flesh, leaving it raw and reddened. Your hair was braided with specific knots that symbolized your transition from maiden to wife, each twist pulling painfully at your scalp while elderly women muttered incantations in voices worn thin by years of witnessing such ceremonies. The negotiations that sealed your fate concluded weeks ago without your voice being heard. Your father and future husband had haggled over your bride price like merchants discussing the worth of livestock at market. The munter the payment your husband's family made for you determined your value in silver, land, and cattle. You learned that your worth equaled 8 milk cows and 40 pieces of silver, a sum both families considered fair for a girl of your social standing and bloodline. As evening approached with the inevitability of winter, you were dressed in your bridal costume, heavy woolen garments dyed with expensive imported colors that scratched against your still tender skin. The bridal crown, a family heirloom weighing several pounds, was placed on your head with such ceremonial force that an immediate headache bloomed behind your temples. The metal pressing against your skull served as a constant reminder of the weight of expectations now resting upon your shoulders. The wedding feast unfolded in the great hall, where you sat in mandated silence while men around you consumed alarming quantities of mead and ale. Their voices grew louder and more boisterous as the night progressed, and fragments of crude jokes about what awaited you drifted to your ears despite your attempts to ignore them. The feast included ritualistic elements that made your discomfort increase with each passing hour, your husband-to-be drinking from a ceremonial horn while making oaths that included explicit references to your fertility and his anticipated sexual prowess. The most disturbing aspect arrived with the bedding ceremony. This wasn't a private moment between newlyweds, but a public ritual involving the entire wedding party in a display that prioritized legal validation over personal dignity. Male guests escorted your new husband to the bedchamber while female relatives accompanied you, all singing traditional songs with lyrics that graphically described the sexual act you were about to perform. These songs, passed down through generations like precious heirlooms, used agricultural metaphors comparing your body to a field ready for plowing and seeding. In the bedchamber, witnesses remained present to ensure the marriage's consummation occurred as required by law and custom. Your female relatives helped remove your clothing while offering advice that ranged from practical to mortifying. They discussed techniques for pleasing your husband and warned you about the pain you would experience, describing the ordeal with the casual matter-of-factness of women discussing any other household chore. The witnesses wouldn't depart until they heard evidence that the marriage had been properly consummated, a custom designed to prevent future legal disputes about the union's validity. Your husband, likely a stranger you'd met only a handful of times during the betrothal period, approached the bed while still partially intoxicated from the evening's festivities. His breath carried the sour scent of fermented honey, and his movements held the particular careful deliberation of a man fighting the effects of too much drink. The sexual encounter that followed was purely functional, focused entirely on establishing his dominance and your submission within the bonds of marriage. There was no consideration for your comfort or pleasure concepts that wouldn't become associated with marriage for many centuries yet to come. The physical act was often violent, viewed as the husband's legal right to claim what had become his property through the exchange of silver and vows. Your cries of pain were expected, even welcomed as proof that you had come to marriage as a virgin. The witnesses outside the chamber waited for these sounds as confirmation that the union had been properly sealed in the eyes of both law and community. But your wedding night's ordeals didn't conclude with that initial consummation. According to Norse tradition, you and your new husband must remain secluded in the bedchamber for 3 full days and nights, during which time you were expected to engage in repeated sexual intercourse to maximize the chances of immediate pregnancy. Food and drink were brought to you by servants, but you were essentially prisoners in that small room while your husband exercised his conjugal rights whenever desire struck him. During these 3 days of enforced intimacy, you experienced the full reality of your altered status in the world. You were no longer your father's daughter but your husband's property, possessing no legal rights independent of his will and whims. If you displeased him in any way, he could beat you with full legal sanction. If you failed to produce children, particularly the sons that every Norse family desperately needed, he could divorce you by simply declaring his intent before witnesses. If you committed adultery, the penalty was death by stoning or drowning, while his extramarital affairs were not only tolerated but actively expected as proof of his virility. The most psychologically damaging aspect of this transformation was the complete loss of personal autonomy. Your previous life, however limited by the standards of medieval society, had at least included some measure of freedom of movement within your father's household. Now, you couldn't make decisions about your daily activities, your friendships, your clothing, or even the food you ate without your husband's explicit permission. You had essentially become a valuable breeding animal, and your worth would be measured entirely by your ability to produce healthy male heirs who could carry forward the family name and inheritance. As the 3-day seclusion period concluded, you emerged from the bedchamber to discover that your social position had been fundamentally altered in ways both visible and invisible. Other women in the household, including servants who had once been your equals, now looked to you for direction and guidance in domestic matters. Yet you possessed no training for these new responsibilities, having been thrust into a role that demanded immediate competence in managing complex household affairs while simultaneously adapting to your husband's expectations and demands. The bruises from your wedding night served as daily reminders of your new reality, tender spots that ached when you moved certain ways or when fabric brushed against them. These physical marks would fade within days, but the psychological impact of the experience would shape every aspect of your future existence. The trauma of that first night often had effects that lasted for years, though there were no words in your language to describe what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe stress and emotional damage. Many Norse women developed what modern psychology would identify as post-traumatic stress recurring nightmares, persistent anxiety, episodes of overwhelming sadness, and a general sense of detachment from their own lives. But there was no concept of mental health care in Viking society, and such reactions were typically viewed as character flaws rather than natural responses to traumatic experiences. Women who struggled to adapt to married life were often blamed for bringing shame upon their families, adding guilt to their existing emotional burdens. Your daily existence now revolved entirely around your husband's schedule and needs, creating a rhythm of service that began before dawn and continued until he chose to retire for the night. You woke in the cold darkness to prepare his breakfast, ensuring that hot food awaited him when he emerged from sleep. Your own hunger became secondary to his satisfaction, and you quickly learned that questioning his decisions or expressing any form of dissatisfaction resulted in physical punishment that carried both legal sanction and social approval. The constant fear of pregnancy added another layer of anxiety to your existence, creating a paradox that defined much of Norse women's experience. While bearing children represented your primary purpose and the source of whatever respect you might earn, childbirth in the Viking Age carried enormous dangers that claimed the lives of countless mothers. You had likely witnessed friends and relatives die in labor, their final screams echoing in your memory as stark reminders that each pregnancy could be your last. There was no effective medical care available, no methods for managing the pain of labor, and no guarantee that either you or your child would survive the ordeal. The birthing process itself took place in circumstances that offered little comfort or safety. When your time came, you would be attended by other women whose knowledge came from experience rather than formal training. They would encourage you to squat or kneel during labor, believing that gravity would assist the birth, while offering herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness for pain relief. If complications arose if the baby was positioned incorrectly, if bleeding couldn't be controlled, if fever set in after the birth, the available treatments were limited and often ineffective. Infant mortality rates were devastatingly high, with perhaps half of all children dying before reaching their 5th birthday. This harsh reality meant that even successful pregnancies might end in heartbreak, as diseases that modern medicine easily treats claimed young lives with shocking regularity. The emotional toll of losing children was compounded by the social pressure to continue producing offspring, creating cycles of grief and hope that shaped women's psychological landscapes throughout their reproductive years. The social dynamics within Norse households created additional pressures that complicated women's daily lives. If your husband took concubines or slaves as additional sexual partners, a practice considered normal and even expected, you were required to manage these relationships diplomatically while maintaining your position as the primary wife. Jealousy or complaints about such arrangements were viewed as signs of poor character, forcing you to suppress natural emotional responses in favor of stoic acceptance. The legal framework surrounding marriage offered women virtually no protection from abuse or abandonment. Divorce laws heavily favored men, who could dissolve marriages for reasons ranging from adultery to simple incompatibility, while women faced severe restrictions on their ability to leave unsatisfactory unions. A divorced woman often found herself in an impossible social position, no longer protected by her husband's status, but unable to return to her father's household without bringing shame upon her family. Economic dependence reinforced women's vulnerability within marriage, as they typically had no independent means of support. While some women inherited property or managed household finances, these resources remained technically under their husband's control. The skills that women developed, textile production, food preparation, household management, were valuable but offered limited opportunities for economic independence in a society structured around male authority and ownership. The religious and cultural beliefs that justified these harsh realities permeated every aspect of Norse society, creating ideological frameworks that made resistance seem both futile and morally wrong. The gods themselves were portrayed as endorsing male dominance, with Odin and Thor serving as models of masculine authority, while goddesses like Frigg and Freya, despite their power, remained subordinate to male deities in the cosmic hierarchy. Yet within these constraints, some women found ways to exercise influence and create meaningful lives. Those who successfully managed households, produced healthy children, and navigated political relationships could earn genuine respect and even limited autonomy. A few exceptional women, those born into powerful families or married to particularly successful men, managed to transcend typical gender limitations and wield significant political influence. The contrast between such exceptional cases and the experiences of ordinary women highlights the complexity of gender relations in Viking society. While the culture produced legendary figures like the Shield Maidens celebrated in later sagas, the vast majority of women lived lives constrained by legal, economic, and social limitations that left them with minimal control over their own destinies. This was the harsh reality of Viking wedding nights and the marriages they initiated, not romantic adventures but traumatic transitions into lives of legal subjugation and social constraint. The rituals that seemed so disturbing to modern audiences represented normal aspects of a society that viewed women primarily as property and reproductive resources, rather than as individuals worthy of consideration and respect. Understanding these practices provides crucial insight into both the specific brutalities of medieval life and the long, ongoing struggle for gender equality that continues to shape our world today. The echoes of these ancient customs lingered in European marriage laws for centuries, gradually giving way to more egalitarian concepts only through the persistent efforts of those who recognized that human dignity shouldn't depend on gender. As you drift toward sleep tonight, you can find comfort in knowing that the frightened young woman whose wedding night we've witnessed represents a world that, while historically significant, has largely passed into the realm of memory and scholarship rather than lived experience. As we turn from the intimate brutalities of marriage customs to the grand stage of political power, we encounter Eric Haraldsson, known to history as Eric Bloodaxe, a figure whose very name has become synonymous with the violent extremes of medieval rulership. His story unfolds like a dark saga filled with fratricide, political intrigue, and the relentless pursuit of power that ultimately consumed both him and those around him. Eric was born around 895 CE into circumstances that seemed to guarantee greatness. As the favored son of Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway, he entered a world where royal blood carried both immense privilege and deadly responsibility. Harald had unified much of Norway through a combination of military conquest and political maneuvering, creating a kingdom that represented one of the most significant achievements in early medieval Scandinavia. Yet this very success would plant the seeds of his son's eventual destruction. The Norway of Eric's youth was a land still finding its political identity. Harald Fairhair's unification had been relatively recent and remained fragile, dependent on personal loyalties rather than established institutions. The king maintained power through a complex network of regional jarls, each controlling their own territories while acknowledging Harald's supremacy. This system required constant attention and occasional displays of force to prevent ambitious subordinates from challenging royal authority. Harald's approach to succession reflected both the opportunities and dangers of his position. Like many medieval rulers, he had fathered numerous children through multiple wives and concubines, a strategy designed to ensure the dynasty's continuation while forging political alliances through marriage. The result was a large family of half-siblings who would theoretically support each other, but who also represented potential rivals for the throne. Among all these children, Eric stood out from an early age, displaying qualities that marked him as his father's likely heir. The young prince's education reflected the violent realities of Viking society and the specific demands of royal leadership. He learned swordplay and spearfighting alongside the traditional skills of statecraft, but more importantly, he absorbed the brutal political lessons that would define his approach to power. In the Norse world, kingship wasn't simply inherited through birthright, it had to be seized and held through a combination of strength, cunning, and the willingness to eliminate threats before they could mature into genuine challenges. Eric's first taste of independent command came during his teenage years when he began leading raiding expeditions to the British Isles. These weren't random acts of piracy but carefully planned military operations designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. The raids gathered wealth in the form of silver, gold, and valuable trade goods that could be used to reward followers and fund future campaigns. They also captured slaves who represented both economic assets and potential diplomatic tools. Most importantly, from Eric's perspective, successful raids enhanced his reputation as a military commander and attracted experienced warriors to his banner. The young prince proved exceptionally capable in these endeavors, demonstrating both tactical intelligence and the personal courage that Norse warriors valued above almost all other qualities. His ships returned from expeditions laden with treasure, and stories of his battlefield prowess spread throughout Scandinavia. Veterans who had served under his command spoke admiringly of his leadership style, which combined careful planning with aggressive execution. Eric was building the foundation of support that any successful king would need. But it was Eric's domestic political maneuvering that truly revealed the ruthless ambition that would define his career. As Harald Fairhair aged and questions of succession became increasingly urgent, the king's numerous sons began positioning themselves for the eventual struggle over the throne. Norse inheritance laws didn't establish clear primogeniture, the crown didn't automatically pass to the eldest son. Instead, kings were chosen based on their ability to command loyalty, control territory, and maintain power against both internal and external challenges. This system inevitably led to conflict among royal siblings, but Eric's approach was uniquely systematic and coldly calculated. Rather than wait for his father's death to press his claim, he began eliminating potential rivals while Harald still lived. His first victim was his half-brother Bjorn, whom Eric killed in what was officially described as a hunting accident. The circumstances surrounding Bjorn's death were suspicious enough that few people believed the official story, but they were also ambiguous enough that direct accusations couldn't easily be made. The message, however, was unmistakably clear to Eric's other brothers. The prince would not share power, would not tolerate competition, and possessed both the will and the capability to remove obstacles to his ambitions. Some of his siblings fled Norway immediately, seeking refuge in foreign courts where they hoped to wait out Eric's rise and perhaps find opportunities to challenge him later. Others attempted to build their own power bases within Norway, hoping to create defensive alliances strong enough to deter their brother's aggression. Over the following years, Eric systematically eliminated these threats through a campaign of murder that was both methodical and carefully disguised. At least 8 of his brothers died under circumstances that ranged from obviously suspicious to barely plausible accidents. Each killing was planned to avoid direct blame while sending an unmistakable message about Eric's intentions and capabilities. The surviving princes faced an increasingly stark choice: flee Norway and abandon their claims to the throne, or remain and risk joining their deceased siblings. Harald Fairhair found himself in an impossible position as these events unfolded. Despite his advanced age, the old king wasn't blind to his son's actions, but he faced a dilemma that would challenge any ruler. Punishing Eric risked destabilizing the kingdom and potentially triggering a civil war that could destroy everything Harald had built. Allowing the fratricide to continue was morally reprehensible but might preserve political unity under his chosen successor. Harold's ultimate decision to tacitly support Eric's campaign against his brothers revealed the harsh pragmatism that medieval politics often demanded. When Harold Fairhair finally died in 933 CE, Eric's succession proceeded with little opposition. His surviving brothers had either fled to distant kingdoms or submitted to his authority, recognizing that resistance would likely prove fatal. The systematic elimination of rivals had achieved its intended purpose. Eric faced no serious challengers for the throne and could claim legitimacy through his father's apparent approval. But this victory came at an enormous cost that would haunt Eric's entire reign. He had destroyed much of the royal family, alienating potential supporters and creating a legacy of violence that would define how others viewed his kingship. The nickname Blood Axe reflected not just his prowess in battle but his willingness to murder family members in pursuit of political goals. This reputation made it difficult for Eric to build the broad coalition of support that effective governance required. Eric's reign as King of Norway began with promise but quickly revealed the fundamental limitations of rule based primarily on fear and violence. While his brutal elimination of rivals had secured the throne, it had also created deep resentment among the nobility and common people. Many Norwegians viewed him as a kinslayer, one of the most serious moral crimes in Norse society, condemned by both traditional law and religious teaching. This reputation made potential allies wary of associating too closely with the new king, fearing that his violent tendencies might eventually turn against them. The king's problems were compounded by external challenges that tested both his military capabilities and his political judgment. Denmark and Sweden, Norway's traditional rivals, recognized the instability created by Eric's violent rise to power and moved to exploit perceived weaknesses. Danish raids increased along Norway's southern borders, probing for signs that the new king couldn't effectively defend his territory. Swedish forces pressed from the east, testing Eric's ability to maintain control over the remote regions that his father had brought under Norwegian authority. Eric's military responses to these challenges followed patterns established during his rise to power. They were characteristically brutal but increasingly counterproductive. His armies could win individual battles through superior tactics and his personal leadership on the battlefield, but his harsh treatment of defeated enemies eliminated opportunities for diplomatic solutions to ongoing conflicts. When Eric's forces captured Danish or Swedish nobles, he typically ordered their execution rather than seeking ransoms that might have provided both immediate revenue and future diplomatic leverage. This approach created escalating cycles of violence that drained Norway's resources while failing to resolve underlying conflicts. Each Danish raid met with increasingly harsh retaliation, which in turn prompted more aggressive Danish responses. The Swedish situation followed similar patterns, with border conflicts gradually expanding into more serious confrontations that required significant military commitments to resolve. The most serious challenge to Eric's rule came from an unexpected source: his half-brother Håkon, who had survived the fratricidal campaign by fleeing to England years earlier. Rather than simply hiding in exile, Håkon had spent his time productively, learning English military tactics and diplomatic strategies while cultivating relationships with powerful Anglo-Saxon nobles. Most importantly, he had deliberately cultivated a reputation for fairness and mercy that presented a stark contrast to his brother's brutal methods. King Athelstan of England had welcomed Håkon as both a refugee and a potentially useful political asset. The English king understood that a Norwegian prince with legitimate claims to the throne might someday prove valuable in Anglo-Saxon diplomatic efforts. Athelstan provided Håkon with military training, political education, and most crucially, the resources necessary to eventually challenge Eric's rule. When Håkon finally returned to Norway in 935 CE, he found a kingdom ready for change. Eric's harsh policies had alienated much of the population, while his constant warfare had drained the royal treasury and exhausted the nobility's patience. The contrast between the two brothers couldn't have been more striking. Where Eric ruled through fear and violence, Håkon promised justice and reconciliation. The invasion force that accompanied Håkon was relatively small, but it quickly attracted Norwegian supporters who saw an opportunity to overthrow a king they had grown to despise. Key nobles who had reluctantly supported Eric began switching sides, bringing their own followers and resources to Håkon's cause. The speed with which support shifted revealed how fragile Eric's position had actually become despite his apparent military strength. The civil war that followed was brief but decisive, lasting only about a year before reaching its climax at the Battle of Fitjar in 936 CE. Eric's military skills, which had served him so well in previous conflicts, couldn't compensate for his lack of popular support and political legitimacy. At crucial moments during the battle, Units that should have been loyal to the king either fled the field or openly joined Haakon's forces. Erik found himself commanding a steadily shrinking army against opponents who seemed to multiply with each passing hour. The defeat at Fitjar was complete and devastating. Erik's remaining supporters were either killed in the fighting or captured by Haakon's forces, leaving the king with no choice but to flee Norway with his immediate family and a small group of loyal retainers. The kingdom that he had fought so brutally to control slipped from his grasp in a matter of hours, transformed from a source of power into a symbol of his failure. Erik's exile marked the beginning of his transformation from king to mercenary warlord, a degrading journey that would define the remainder of his life. Accompanied by his wife Gunhild and their children, he sought refuge in various courts throughout the Viking world, discovering that his reputation as a kinslayer severely limited his options. While his skills as a military commander were undeniable, many potential hosts feared that Erik's presence would bring violence and instability to their own kingdoms. The exiled king eventually found employment in the chaotic politics of Anglo-Saxon England, where ongoing succession disputes and persistent Viking raids created opportunities for experienced warriors. Erik served various English rulers as a mercenary commander, leading mixed forces of Norse and Anglo-Saxon fighters in campaigns throughout northern England. These engagements provided him with income and purpose, but also served as constant reminders of how far he had fallen from his previous royal status. But Erik's ambitions extended far beyond simple mercenary service. His ultimate goal remained the restoration of his royal dignity, preferably through the acquisition of new territories that he could rule independently. In 948 CE, an opportunity arose when political turmoil in Northumbria created a power vacuum that an ambitious and capable leader might fill. Northumbria had been contested territory for decades, changing hands between Viking and Anglo-Saxon rulers with bewildering frequency. The region's strategic importance, controlling key trade routes and serving as a buffer between English and Scottish territories, made it valuable to multiple competing powers. Erik's seizure of control represented another chapter in this ongoing struggle, but also his best chance to re-establish himself as a legitimate ruler. His conquest of Northumbria demonstrated that Erik retained both his military capabilities and his political ambitions despite years of exile and humiliation. The campaign was executed with the same tactical brilliance that had characterized his earlier victories, combining careful planning with decisive action. Within months, Erik had established himself as king of Northumbria, creating a power base from which he might eventually challenge Haakon's rule in Norway. However, Erik's rule in Northumbria proved as controversial and ultimately unsuccessful as his previous reign in Norway. His harsh taxation policies, designed to fund both defensive measures and potential offensive campaigns, quickly alienated his new subjects. The English population viewed him as a foreign tyrant whose primary loyalty lay elsewhere, while local Norse settlers questioned his legitimacy and worried about the consequences of supporting another failed royal venture. The fundamental problem was that Erik had learned nothing from his earlier failure. He continued to rely on intimidation and violence rather than building genuine political consensus, creating the same patterns of resentment and resistance that had ultimately destroyed his Norwegian kingdom. Within 2 years of seizing power, he faced rebellions that stretched his limited resources to the breaking point. The end came in 954 CE at a place called Stane Moor, high in the Pennine Mountains where the ancient Roman road crossed some of the most desolate terrain in northern England. Erik was traveling with a small retinue when they were ambushed by forces loyal to Eadred, King of England. The details of his death remain unclear and disputed among historical sources. Some suggest he was killed in fair combat while attempting to fight his way clear of the ambush, while others claim he was murdered while trying to negotiate surrender terms. What remains certain is that Erik Bloodaxe, one of the most feared warriors and ruthless politicians of his age, died in exile far from the Norway he had fought so desperately to rule. His death marked not just the end of a remarkable individual life, but the conclusion of an entire approach to medieval kingship that prioritized personal prowess and violent intimidation over consensus building and legitimate governance. The immediate aftermath of Erik's death revealed the long-term consequences of his political methods. His sons, despite their royal blood and their father's military reputation, never successfully claimed thrones in either Norway or England. The violent precedent that Erik had established made other rulers extremely wary of supporting his descendants, fearing that they might have inherited their father's ruthless and ultimately self-destructive nature. The bloodline that had once seemed destined for greatness instead faded gradually into historical obscurity. Erik's wife Gunhild continued to play a role in Scandinavian politics for some years after his death, but their children never achieved the prominence that their royal heritage might have suggested. The systematic destruction of family relationships that had characterized Eric's rise to power left his descendants isolated and vulnerable in a political system that valued kinship networks and family alliances. Modern historians continue to debate Eric Bloodaxe's ultimate legacy and historical significance. Some scholars view him as a skilled military leader whose harsh methods were unfortunate but perhaps necessary given the violent realities of his time and the challenges facing early medieval rulers. They argue that his techniques for eliminating rivals and consolidating power, while morally questionable, represented rational responses to the genuine threats facing any Norwegian king during this period of political consolidation. Other historians see Eric as a cautionary example of how political violence and rule by intimidation can ultimately undermine effective governance and legitimate authority. They point out that his systematic destruction of family relationships and his reliance on fear rather than consent created inherent instabilities that made his eventual downfall almost inevitable. From this perspective, Eric's career demonstrates the importance of building broad political coalitions and maintaining moral legitimacy in medieval kingship. What seems undeniable is that Eric's story provides crucial insights into the complex dynamics of power, violence, and legitimacy in the Viking world. His life embodied both the strengths and fundamental weaknesses of Norse political culture during a crucial period of historical transition. The emphasis on personal prowess and military leadership that characterized Viking society could produce remarkable individual achievements, but it could also generate destructive cycles of violence that consumed both rulers and their subjects. As we prepare to leave Eric Bloodaxe to his final rest in the cold mountains of northern England, his story serves as a bridge between the personal brutalities we witnessed in Viking marriage customs and the broader patterns of power and authority that shaped medieval Scandinavian civilization. The same cultural values that reduced women to property in marriage ceremonies also created political systems where royal brothers murdered each other for crowns, where strength mattered more than justice, and where the cycle of violence seemed to perpetuate itself across generations until it finally consumed those who had initiated it. From the violent machinations of kings, we drift now into the realm of mystery and discovery, where the careful work of archaeologists has revealed secrets that challenge everything we thought we knew about power and authority in Viking society. In the summer of 1904, beneath the gentle rolling hills of Norway's Vestfold region, a Norwegian farmer named Knut Rom made a discovery that would transform our understanding of medieval Scandinavian civilization and pose questions that continue to intrigue researchers more than a century later. Rom was engaged in the mundane task of expanding his cultivated fields when his spade struck something unexpectedly hard beneath the dark earth. What he had found, buried under tons of soil and centuries of accumulated debris, was the preserved bow of a Viking ship, but not just any vessel. This was the beginning of one of archaeology's most spectacular discoveries, a burial site so rich and complex that it would require years of careful excavation to fully reveal its secrets. The site itself had appeared unremarkable to generations of local residents. The large earthen mound near Tonsberg had been a familiar landmark for centuries, one of many similar formations scattered across the Norwegian landscape that people assumed contained typical Viking burials, perhaps a warrior with his weapons, or a wealthy farmer with some precious possessions. But as excavation began under the direction of archaeologist Gabriel Gustafsson, it became increasingly clear that this was something far more extraordinary than anyone had anticipated. What the mound concealed was a burial chamber of unprecedented richness and complexity, centered around a magnificent ship that had been deliberately interred as a tomb. The vessel measured nearly 22 meters in length, constructed from carefully selected oak planks fastened with hundreds of iron rivets. Every aspect of its design spoke to the pinnacle of 9th-century shipbuilding technology: sleek lines that would have cut efficiently through water, elegant curves that balanced speed with stability, and decorative elements that transformed functional craftsmanship into something approaching art. But this wasn't a working vessel designed purely for practical purposes. The ship's construction and decoration indicated that it had served ceremonial functions, possibly carrying royalty during important state processions or religious observances. The decision to convert such a valuable asset into a tomb represented an enormous sacrifice of resources, suggesting that whoever lay buried within commanded extraordinary wealth and social status. The burial chamber itself had been constructed within the ship's stern, transformed into an elaborate wooden room furnished with textiles, furniture, and grave goods that would have represented unimaginable luxury in the 9th century. As excavators carefully removed centuries of accumulated earth and debris, they revealed a treasure trove that read like an inventory of the finest craftsmanship and most expensive trade goods available in medieval Scandinavia. 2 women had been laid to rest in this magnificent tomb, surrounded by objects that spoke to their high status and the respect accorded to them by those who arranged their burial. The identity of these women remains one of archaeology's most compelling mysteries, a puzzle that has engaged scholars for generations and continues to generate new theories as advancing technology provides fresh insights into their lives and deaths. The grave goods discovered within the Oseberg burial created an immediate sensation in the archaeological world. Wooden artifacts alone represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor, intricately carved bedposts decorated with writhing animal motifs, ceremonial sleds that might have been used in religious processions, and a four-wheeled cart whose elaborate decorations suggested it had served important ritual functions. The quality of the woodwork, featuring complex interlacing patterns and sophisticated animal imagery, demonstrated the existence of master craftsmen working exclusively for the royal court. Textile fragments preserved within the burial provided equally remarkable insights into Viking material culture and the extensive trade networks that supplied Scandinavian elites. Silk threads woven into decorative bands proved that Norwegian royalty had access to luxury goods imported from as far away as Constantinople and even China. The presence of high-quality woolen fabrics demonstrated sophisticated domestic production capabilities, while various imported materials indicated participation in international commerce that spanned continents and connected the fjords of Norway to the great trading cities of Europe and Asia. Perhaps the most intriguing artifacts were those that suggested religious or magical practices played important roles in these women's lives. The burial included what appeared to be ritual staffs, ceremonial bowls, and other objects that may have been used in religious ceremonies or magical rituals. Some scholars interpret these items as evidence that one or both women served as vulvas, the powerful female shamans who occupied crucial positions in Viking spiritual life, serving as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. The ship burial also contained a remarkable collection of everyday items that provided intimate glimpses into daily life among the Viking elite. Kitchen equipment indicated sophisticated food preparation techniques, while looms and textile tools suggested that even royal women participated in the production of fine fabrics. Personal care items, combs, mirrors, and cosmetic implements painted a picture of people who devoted considerable attention to their appearance and personal hygiene. The presence of these mundane objects alongside ceremonial items reveals something profound about Viking concepts of the afterlife. Rather than viewing death as a complete separation from earthly concerns, Norse religious beliefs apparently included expectations that the deceased would continue engaging in familiar activities. The women buried in Oseberg were equipped not just for a journey to the afterlife, but for ongoing existence that would include many of the same responsibilities and pleasures they had known in life. Physical examination of the human remains provided additional clues about these mysterious women's identities and circumstances. The older woman, estimated to be between 70 and 80 years old at the time of death, had achieved remarkable longevity for the Viking period. Her advanced age suggested access to exceptional nutrition and medical care throughout her life, privileges available only to the highest levels of society. Her skeleton showed evidence of arthritis and other age-related conditions, but no signs of violent death, indicating that she had died from natural causes. The younger woman, approximately 50 years old at death, presented a more puzzling case that continues to generate scholarly debate. Her skeletal remains showed evidence of a significant spinal condition that would have caused chronic pain and possibly limited her mobility. Some researchers have suggested that such physical afflictions might have been interpreted as signs of divine favor or special spiritual power in Viking culture, potentially explaining her inclusion in such an elaborate burial alongside someone of obvious royal status. The timing of the burial, established through dendrochronological analysis of the wood to approximately 834 CE, places these women's deaths during a crucial period in Norwegian history. This was the era when local chieftains were consolidating power and beginning the process of political unification that would eventually create the Kingdom of Norway under Harald Fairhair. The women buried in Oseberg may have been key players in these political developments, their deaths marking either the end of one political arrangement or the beginning of another. Historical sources from this period are frustratingly sparse and often unreliable, but some tantalizing clues exist about who these women might have been. The Norwegian historian Snorri Sturluson, writing centuries later, mentions Queen Asa, who controlled significant territory in Vestfold during the 9th century and served as the grandmother of Harald Fairhair. If one of the Oseberg women was indeed Queen Asa, it would explain both the extraordinary wealth displayed in the burial and the ship's obvious importance as a royal vessel. The identity of the second woman remains even more mysterious and has generated considerable scholarly debate. Early theories suggested she might have been a slave or servant sacrificed to accompany her mistress into the afterlife, a practice documented in other Viking burials and mentioned in historical accounts of Scandinavian funeral customs. However, the careful positioning of both bodies and the quality of grave goods placed near each woman suggest a more complex relationship than simple mistress and servant. More recent scholarship has proposed that both women might have been royalty in their own right, perhaps representing different branches of a ruling family or even co-rulers who shared power in some form of joint sovereignty. This interpretation would be consistent with evidence from other parts of the Viking world where women occasionally wielded significant political authority, either as regents for minor children or as rulers in their own right when male heirs were unavailable. The preservation conditions within the Oseberg burial have allowed researchers to reconstruct aspects of Viking elite life that are rarely visible in the archaeological record. Analysis of food remains found within the burial chamber revealed details about royal diet and cooking techniques, including evidence for elaborate food preparation methods and the use of imported spices and seasonings. The presence of exotic foods demonstrated that Viking elites participated in trade networks that brought luxury items from across the known world to their tables. Recent technological advances have revealed new layers of mystery within the Oseberg burial site. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive archaeological techniques have identified additional anomalies within the burial mound that may represent previously unknown chambers or artifact deposits. These discoveries suggest that the excavated ship burial may represent only part of a larger mortuary complex that could contain additional burials or ceremonial structures. DNA analysis of the human remains has provided some answers while raising new questions about these women's origins and relationships. Genetic evidence confirms that the two women were not closely related, supporting theories that they represented different families or held different roles within the political structure. However, both showed genetic markers consistent with Scandinavian ancestry, ruling out earlier theories that one might have been a foreign princess or high-status captive. The broader implications of the Oseberg discovery extend far beyond the specific identities of its occupants. The burial provides crucial evidence for the complexity and sophistication of Viking society, challenging popular stereotypes about medieval Scandinavian culture. The elaborate artistic traditions represented by the grave goods, the extensive international trade networks revealed by imported materials, and the obvious political structures capable of supporting such royal courts all point to a civilization far more refined and cosmopolitan than popular imagination typically suggests. Perhaps most significantly, the Oseberg burial has provided compelling evidence for the high status that women could achieve in Viking society, contradicting many assumptions about gender roles in medieval Scandinavia. The elaborate nature of the burial, the obvious wealth and power represented by the grave goods, and the careful attention paid to ritual details all suggest that these women wielded considerable authority during their lifetimes. The mystery continues to evolve as new analytical techniques reveal additional information about the burial and its occupants. Recent studies of textile fragments have identified previously unknown weaving techniques and dye sources, while analysis of metal artifacts continues to reveal details about Viking metallurgy and trade relationships. Each new discovery adds pieces to the puzzle while simultaneously raising fresh questions about Viking society, political structures, and religious beliefs. The two women who were laid to rest with such ceremony over 1,000 years ago continue to guard their secrets, but modern archaeology steadily chips away at the mysteries surrounding them. Their story serves as a reminder that the Viking world included powerful female figures whose influence extended far beyond the domestic sphere, women who commanded the resources necessary to create monuments to their own importance and whose deaths were mourned with ceremonies that rivaled those accorded to kings. Current research into the Oseberg burial employs increasingly sophisticated methods to extract information from artifacts and remains that earlier generations of archaeologists couldn't access. Microscopic analysis of textile fibers reveals details about production techniques and raw material sources, while chemical analysis of metal objects provides insights into manufacturing processes and trade relationships. Even the wood used in various artifacts continues to yield information about forest management practices and seasonal patterns of construction activity. The ship itself remains one of the most remarkable examples of Viking craftsmanship ever discovered, a masterpiece of medieval engineering that demonstrates the technical capabilities of Scandinavian shipbuilders. Its elegant lines and sophisticated construction techniques represent centuries of accumulated knowledge about working with wood, iron, and other materials to create vessels that could navigate both coastal waters and open seas with equal effectiveness. As we contemplate the Oseberg ship and its mysterious occupants, we're reminded that the Viking world included layers of complexity and sophistication that continue to surprise researchers. The burial represents not just a remarkable archaeological discovery, but a window into a civilization capable of producing both the brutal political violence we witnessed in Eric Bloodaxe's career and the refined artistic achievement displayed in the ship's construction and decoration. The questions surrounding the Oseberg women, their identities, their roles in society, the circumstances that led to their joint burial may never be fully answered. But perhaps that's appropriate for figures who clearly wielded power in a world where authority often remained hidden behind veils of ceremony and tradition. Their silence across the centuries speaks to the enduring mystery of the past and the limitations of even our most sophisticated attempts to understand the lives and motivations of people who lived and died more than a millennium ago. The Oseberg ship burial stands as testament to the complexity of Viking civilization and the remarkable achievements possible even in societies we might be tempted to dismiss as primitive or barbaric. As sleep begins to claim consciousness, we can drift away with images of that magnificent vessel carrying its royal cargo into whatever realm awaits beyond the boundaries of archaeological investigation and historical inquiry. From the mysteries buried beneath Norwegian soil, we ascend now into the warm, flickering light of a great hall where power displayed itself in ways that would have astonished medieval visitors and continue to challenge our assumptions about Viking civilization. Step with me through the massive oak doors of Jarl Magnus Eriksson's hall on a winter evening in 10th century Norway, and enter a world that defied every expectation of medieval austerity and simplicity. The structure itself dominated the landscape like a wooden cathedral dedicated to earthly power and pleasure. Easily 40 meters in length and 15 meters in width, the hall rose from the snowy ground with an authority that could be felt from considerable distance. Its soaring roof, supported by intricately carved pillars depicting scenes from Norse mythology, reached nearly 12 meters above the floor, creating a space grand enough to accommodate hundreds of guests during the most elaborate celebrations and political gatherings. The entrance alone announced the wealth and status of those who lived within. Massive oak doors, reinforced with iron bands and decorated with bronze fittings that had been imported at considerable expense from Constantinople, required the combined strength of 2 men to open properly. These metal hinges and decorative elements represented more accumulated wealth than most farmers would encounter in their entire lifetimes, crafted by master smiths who understood that every visible detail of a jarl's residence reflected his political authority and social position. Stepping across the threshold, visitors found themselves immediately overwhelmed by the hall's interior grandeur. The floor, unlike the packed earth or rough planking common in peasant dwellings, consisted of carefully fitted oak boards that had been sanded smooth and treated with linseed oil until they gleamed like polished glass in the firelight. Covering strategic portions of this magnificent flooring were rugs and tapestries acquired through trade networks that stretched from Iceland in the west to the Black Sea in the East, Byzantine silks that shimmered with golden thread, Flemish woolen hangings dyed in rich purples and deep reds, and occasional pieces from as far away as Persia and India. The hall's centerpiece was the high seat itself, a throne-like chair that served as both furniture and symbol of divine authority. Carved from a single massive piece of oak and inlaid with silver wire depicting ravens and wolves, the sacred animals associated with Odin, this wasn't merely a place to sit, but a physical manifestation of the Jarl's connection to the gods themselves. The chair was positioned precisely in the center of the hall's long side, allowing its occupant to observe every corner of his domain while remaining visible to all who entered his presence. Flanking this throne were the high seat pillars, tall carved posts covered with runic inscriptions that proclaimed the Jarl's genealogy and claimed divine ancestry stretching back to the gods themselves. Whether these genealogical claims possessed any historical validity mattered less than their political effectiveness in a society where legitimacy often depended on supernatural sanction. Such displays of cosmic connection carried enormous weight in establishing and maintaining authority. Warmth in this vast space came from a central hearth that represented both engineering marvel and artistic achievement. Rather than a simple fire pit dug into the floor, the Jarl's hearth consisted of a raised stone platform decorated with intricate carvings and surrounded by bronze fire dogs cast in the shapes of mythological beasts. The chimney system, representing an architectural innovation that most European buildings wouldn't adopt for several more centuries, drew smoke efficiently upward while maintaining the dramatic visual effect of flickering flames illuminating the hall's elaborate decorations. The daily routine within such an establishment began before dawn with the organized chaos of feeding and managing a household that might include over 200 people during the winter months when travel became difficult and the Jarl's extended community gathered for mutual protection and shared resources. The immediate family, the Jarl's personal warriors, their wives and children, servants both free and enslaved, skilled craftsmen, and various political hangers-on all lived within or immediately adjacent to the Great Hall, creating a complex social ecosystem governed by strict hierarchies and intricate protocols. Morning meals in the hall demonstrated the sophisticated logistics required to maintain such an elaborate establishment. Long tables capable of seating dozens of people each were arranged in precise order based on social rank and current political relationships. The Jarl and his immediate family occupied the high table, elevated on a wooden platform that allowed them to overlook the entire assembly while emphasizing their elevated status. Below them, Warriors sat according to their individual reputations and length of service, with the most honored fighters positioned closest to the high seat, while newer or less distinguished men found themselves relegated to the hall's far reaches. The food served at these communal meals reflected both the Jarl's personal wealth and the extensive trade networks that supported Viking civilization throughout Scandinavia. While common people throughout the region might subsist on porridge made from whatever grains they could grow, supplemented with occasional fish or preserved meat, the Jarl's table groaned under the weight of imported delicacies that had traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles to reach the Norwegian coast. A typical breakfast in the Jarl's hall might include fresh bread made from imported wheat flour rather than the coarse barley or oatmeal common among ordinary people. Honey imported from distant forests sweetened drinks and foods, while preserved fruits that had originated in warmer climates provided variety and nutrition during the long winter months. Even the salt used to preserve and flavor food came from specialized sources, traded through networks that connected Norwegian fjords to salt-producing regions throughout northern Europe. The kitchen operations supporting these elaborate meals represented marvels of medieval organization and logistics. Separate buildings housed smokehouse operations where fish and meat were preserved for long-term storage, brewing facilities where ale and mead were produced in quantities sufficient to supply hundreds of people, and storage areas designed to protect the vast quantities of food required to sustain the household through months when fresh supplies were unavailable. Skilled cooks, many of whom were slaves or servants who had been captured during raids on wealthy monasteries or foreign courts, prepared dishes using techniques learned throughout the Viking world. These culinary specialists brought knowledge acquired in Ireland, England, Francia, and even more distant regions, creating a sophisticated cuisine that bore little resemblance to the simple boiled meat and coarse bread that characterized most medieval diets. The administrative demands of managing the Jarl's territories required levels of literacy and record-keeping that contradict popular stereotypes about Viking intellectual capabilities. While relatively few Norsemen possessed the ability to read Latin, many members of the elite were literate in runic scripts, and the Jarl's hall typically included scribes capable of maintaining detailed records of tribute payments, trade agreements, legal decisions, and diplomatic correspondence. These documents, inscribed on carefully prepared vellum or carved into specially prepared wooden tablets, represented a sophisticated understanding of governmental administration that rivaled contemporary European kingdoms. The Jarl scribes tracked seasonal tax collections from subordinate farmers, recorded the terms of commercial agreements with visiting merchants, and maintained correspondence with other Jarls, kings, and even foreign rulers whose territories might be hundreds of miles distant. Afternoon hours often brought visitors whose very presence demonstrated the Jarl's political importance and the extensive connections that maintained his power and influence. Messengers arrived regularly carrying news from other Norwegian Jarls, updates from the royal court, and occasionally communications from foreign courts where Norwegian political developments might affect international relationships. These communications networks kept the Jarl informed about political changes, military movements, and economic opportunities throughout Scandinavia and beyond. Merchants represented another category of frequent visitors, arriving with goods acquired during trading expeditions that might have taken them as far as the Russian principalities, the British Isles, or even the Mediterranean Sea. These commercial relationships weren't merely economic transactions, but formed crucial components of the political alliances that helped maintain the Jarl's authority and provided access to the luxury goods that supported his lifestyle. Evening entertainment transformed the Great Hall into a cultural venue that could rival the courts of the most sophisticated European kings. Professional skalds, poet-entertainers who combined the functions of historian, journalist, and performing artist presented epic poems that could continue for hours while maintaining audience attention through their skilled use of rhythm, alliteration, and dramatic narrative techniques. These performances weren't simple recitations of familiar stories but elaborate theatrical presentations involving multiple voices, musical accompaniment, and dramatic gestures that brought ancient myths and contemporary events to vivid life. The skalds' repertoires included not only traditional mythological narratives but thinly disguised political commentary that addressed current events and personalities through historical allegory and mythological reference. The quality of entertainment available in a wealthy Jarl's hall attracted visitors from throughout Scandinavia and beyond, creating cultural exchanges that influenced artistic development across the Viking world. Musicians performed on instruments imported from across Europe: Irish harps whose clear tones could carry across the entire hall, Frankish lutes that provided rhythmic accompaniment to vocal performances, and Byzantine lyres that created soundscapes far more sophisticated than the simple drums and horns typically associated with Viking culture. Games of skill and chance provided additional entertainment that demonstrated both the players' intellectual capabilities and their access to luxury materials. Elaborate board games carved from walrus ivory and exotic imported woods required strategic thinking and provided opportunities for social interaction that strengthened political relationships while displaying wealth and cultural sophistication. Winter months brought the most elaborate entertainments, when difficult travel conditions confined the Jarl's extended household within the hall's warm confines and created opportunities for celebrations that might continue for weeks. These festivals combined religious observances with political displays, social networking, and pure hedonistic pleasure that would have impressed visiting royalty from any contemporary European court. The 12-day Yule celebrations represented the pinnacle of these winter festivities, featuring daily feasts that showcased the Jarl's wealth, hospitality, and cultural sophistication. Each day brought different courses, entertainment, and social rituals that reinforced hierarchies while providing opportunities for political maneuvering and alliance building among the assembled guests. The clothing worn by the Jarl's family and honored guests during these celebrations represented textile arts that rivaled anything produced elsewhere in medieval Europe. Silk imported from Constantinople was sewn with silver thread into garments that caught and reflected firelight with every movement, creating visual displays that announced the wearer's wealth and taste. Furs from Arctic animals provided both practical warmth and powerful status symbols, while locally produced woolens dyed with expensive imported pigments created color combinations that would have been impossible to achieve using only domestic resources. Personal hygiene and grooming standards among the Viking elite reached levels that wouldn't be matched in many European courts for several more centuries. The Jarl's Hall included dedicated bathing facilities supplied with heated water and imported soaps, while both men and women devoted considerable daily attention to their personal appearance using specialized tools and cosmetics. Combs carved from deer antler and whalebone allowed for precise hairstyling, while tweezers enabled detailed personal grooming that maintained the elevated appearance expected of social elites. Even primitive cosmetics created from imported minerals and plant-based dyes were available to those wealthy enough to afford such luxuries, creating opportunities for personal adornment that enhanced natural beauty while displaying access to rare and expensive materials. The sleeping arrangements within the hall reflected complex social hierarchies while providing levels of comfort that would have seemed incredible to ordinary people throughout medieval Europe. The Jarl's immediate family occupied private chambers furnished with beds featuring carved wooden headboards, linen sheets imported from regions with more sophisticated textile production, and down-filled mattresses that represented luxury almost unimaginable to common people who typically slept on straw pallets or simple wooden planks. Even the warriors' communal sleeping areas provided comfortable accommodations that included quality bedding and personal storage chests for weapons, clothing, and individual possessions. These arrangements recognized that maintaining loyalty among armed followers required providing living conditions that reflected their importance to the Jarl's power and security. Seasonal rhythms brought different activities and atmospheres to the hall's daily operations. Summer months saw much of the household dispersed as warriors departed on raiding expeditions, merchants embarked on trading voyages, and agricultural supervisors traveled to oversee farming operations on the Jarl's scattered properties. These absences created quieter periods that allowed for maintenance and improvement projects designed to keep the hall and its associated buildings in pristine condition. Autumn brought harvest celebrations that demonstrated the Jarl's role as the economic center of his region and the focal point for the complex networks of tribute and trade that sustained his power. Payments from subordinate farmers, craftsmen, and merchants flowed into the hall's storerooms, creating stockpiles that would sustain the household through winter while providing surpluses available for trade and diplomatic gift-giving. The careful management of these seasonal resource flows required sophisticated understanding of economics and logistics that contradicts assumptions about Viking intellectual limitations. The Jarl's administrators tracked agricultural production across widely scattered properties, monitored market conditions that affected trade relationships, and calculated the resources needed to maintain military forces while supporting diplomatic initiatives and cultural activities. Religious observances within the hall reflected the complex spiritual transitions occurring throughout Scandinavia during this period. Traditional Norse religious practices coexisted with increasing Christian influences, creating syncretic ceremonies that blended ancient traditions with newer spiritual concepts. The hall's architectural design included spaces suitable for both traditional Norse rituals and the Christian services that were becoming increasingly important for maintaining political relationships with European courts. The education provided to the Jarl's children prepared them for leadership roles in this sophisticated society that demanded both traditional warrior skills and the intellectual capabilities necessary for effective governance. Boys learned swordplay, horsemanship, and military tactics through direct participation in their father's activities, while also receiving instruction in reading, writing, basic mathematics, and the diplomatic protocols necessary for successful political careers. Girls within the Jarl's family acquired skills in household management, textile production, and the complex social graces necessary for successful political marriages that would advance family interests. Both sexes received extensive education in poetry, music, and the oral traditions that preserved Norse cultural identity while providing the cultural knowledge necessary for effective leadership in a society that valued both martial prowess and intellectual sophistication. This world of luxury and cultural refinement, supported by the labor of hundreds and sustained by trade networks that spanned continents, represented the pinnacle of Viking civilization and challenged every stereotype about medieval Scandinavian society. The great halls of powerful jarls served as centers of political power, economic activity, cultural production, and social innovation that influenced the development of medieval European civilization in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. Living within such establishments provided experiences that combined material comfort, intellectual stimulation, and political intrigue in ways that contradicted assumptions about the limitations of medieval life. The jarls and their families enjoyed standards of living that rivaled contemporary royalty elsewhere in Europe, while participating in cultural activities that preserved and developed sophisticated artistic traditions. The legacy of these elaborate households extended far beyond their immediate political importance, creating cultural traditions and artistic achievements that influenced Scandinavian civilization for centuries after the Viking Age had ended. The combination of wealth, power, and cultural sophistication they represented demonstrates that Viking society included levels of luxury and refinement that could compete with the greatest courts of medieval Europe. As we prepare to leave this warm, firelit hall and return to our own comfortable beds, we carry with us images of a civilization that combined apparent contradictions, brutal political violence alongside sophisticated cultural achievement, international commerce conducted by the same people who engaged in piracy and raiding, and social structures that could simultaneously oppress women while allowing some to achieve remarkable power and influence. The flickering flames that illuminated the Jarl's great hall cast shadows that revealed the complexity of Viking society and the dangers of accepting simple stereotypes about any historical civilization. As sleep approaches and consciousness begins to fade, these shadows lengthen and merge, carrying us toward rest with the knowledge that the past continues to surprise us with its capacity for both beauty and brutality, sophistication and savagery, mystery and revelation.